Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Soy Héctor Zavala. A nombre de nuestro director, el doctor Javier Laguna, les damos la más cordial bienvenida a esta nueva edición de nuestra serie de conversatorios en el campo de las humanidades. En esta ocasión nos vamos a preguntar de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de bioética y estamos muy contentos de tener la participación de excelentes profesores de la UNAM, de la Universidad de Massachusetts y de la Universidad de Washington. Es para mí un gusto invitar a nuestra colega Mariana Imaz para llevar la conducción de esta sesión, presentar a nuestras y nuestros profesores invitados y gestionar el diálogo que seguramente será muy enriquecedor. Mariana, sin más, te doy la palabra para que podamos comenzar esta sesión que seguramente será muy interesante. Excelente día a todas y todos.
So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from, and welcome to the series of conversations about particular topics in the humanities that we're developing here at UNAM Boston. Today, we'll be talking with three academics that have worked on the topic and are still working on the topic of bioethics. It is my pleasure to introduce Sara Goering, James Hughes, and Jennifer Hincapie. And before we start, let me just tell you a little bit more about our speakers today. Sara Goering is a philosopher and chair of the philosophy department at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's a member of the core faculty of the program on ethics and the disability studies program. She's an adjunct in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities, and she co-leads the ethics thrust at the UW Center for Neurotechnology. She teaches courses in bioethics, ethics, philosophy of disability, feminist philosophy, and philosophy of medicine. James Hughes is a sociologist and a senior research fellow at the Applied Ethics Center at UMass Boston. He has taught health policy, bioethic, medical sociology, and research methods in several universities in the United States. In 2005, he co-founded the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies with Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom, and since then he has served as its executive director. And Jennifer Hincapie is also a philosopher, and she is a professor at the School of Medicine at UNAM in Mexico City, where she's also the coordinator of the graduate studies program in bioethics and medical and health sciences. She's currently the director of the university program on bioethics and serves as the advisor of the board of directors of Bioethics Committee at UNESCO. So thank you all three for joining us, having the time, taking the time, and for sharing your knowledge with us. Okay, so let me start with what might seem like a very basic question, but sometimes the basic questions are the hardest questions to answer. And Jennifer, let me start with you. How can we define bioethics, or what do we talk about when we talk about bioethics?
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's for me a very pleasure to be able to be with you. There are many definitions of bioethics, and I think about the diversity itself. I think that bioethics is that dialogical discipline in which all discourses and opinions are here always within the framework of the respect in order to find solution to dilemmas presented by biotechnology and the social context of the medical field. Bioethics is the way to allow us to question those things that are really established for the reason of the temporality and even ignorance we can take granted. Bioethics brings together the intention of the science for progress and consideration that we must have for other manifestation of life. Although it is a young discipline, no more than 60 years old, bioethics bring with it the strengthening of critical thinking, the research of the well-being of all.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Sara, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just thank you for having me. And if I can just add to what Jennifer started us with, I also agree. I think the social context of medicine is a big part of bioethics. So sometimes we think about one part of bioethics as medical ethics, which often gets focused on what happens in a clinic or in a hospital or, inside that specific medical space. But I think bioethics is this broader field, interdisciplinary field of study that looks at the effects of the social world and environmental world on bodies and people and our identities that we bring into those medical settings to try to understand, how we can improve those practices and also improve practices that are outside the scope of medicine. I think there are probably ways that I would think of bioethics as demarcated from other forms of ethics because it's focused on the life sciences or research and practices within the life sciences. But those are kind of porous boundaries. I think there are questions in business ethics or questions in environmental ethics that are going to very clearly overlap with questions that concern bioethicists. And I guess I think we're both interested in existing practices, as Jennifer said, and sort of thinking about assumptions that are taken in those existing practices and potential problems or further effects of those. And then also really, given the introduction you gave for all of us, thinking about future technologies, emerging technologies, and how we can kind of guide those and be aware of the assumptions that we make as they're developing so that they don't reinstate bias or create new forms of discrimination, but really try to enhance well-being. And the last thing I would say is that I think in my own work as well, while much of bioethics is really focused on human life, I think bioethics is broader and can look at non-human animal life and well-being and use in research, as well as kind of broader agricultural things around food production or that sort of thing.
Thank you so much, Sarah. James, please go ahead.
Well, just to add to what's already been said, I think as a sociologist, the thing that really drew me to bioethics was that it was a set of public policy questions that I didn't have any firm answers for myself. When I got into the field, I had come out of development work in Sri Lanka, and I thought this may have been mistaken in retrospect, but I thought that a lot of the problems in development economics were straightforward, but who knows what to do with the brain dead, et cetera. So when I discovered that there was this field where law, medicine, philosophy, religion was all taking part in a conversation about how to do these things, it seemed the right field for me. And I would say in terms of what bioethics is, I've always emphasized the aspect of bioethics coming out of World War II as the assertion of liberal Enlightenment values in regards to the practice of medicine, the response to Nuremberg trials and Tuskegee, et cetera, et cetera. It was really where we began. And if you think about things like the Georgetown Principles, they're really a reaffirmation of Enlightenment ideas. But we've begun to have more of a conversation about global bioethics, Confucian bioethics, African bioethics, and so forth. So it's become a broader field over time. But then just to complete the thought, I think when we used to teach clinical ethics at the University of Chicago, we would say that the goal of becoming a clinical ethicist was not to necessarily come up with the correct opinions, although of course everyone develops opinions, but to understand the history and the architecture of any question that you face so that you can explain to people the ways that people have thought about that and what the upshots of different ways of thinking about a problem would be. And I think that that's pretty much my approach to bioethics as well. I have strong opinions, but as a bioethicist, I think it's always incumbent on us to establish that architecture of the way that the problem has been addressed.
Yes, Sarah, go.
Can I add one more thing? I was thinking about the interdisciplinarity of the field, and in my answer before, I was mainly thinking about content and topics covered by bioethics, but I think there are different methods within bioethics too, given the interdisciplinarity. As a philosopher, I think a lot of times what we bring are conceptual tools to think about the nature of certain concepts that get employed in practice in medicine or in the other areas we talked about. And I think in my own work, some of that is around notions of agency and what do we mean about it? How might it be relational or shared or other things like that? Some of it is normative, really trying to be prescriptive about what ought we to do in any kind of practice. Some of it is really focused on policy making, and I think their legal scholars really have a lot to contribute. I mean, also to the other areas. And then a thing that I've gotten into more recently, which I think is not typical for philosophers, but is for sociologists, is kind of doing empirical ethics, really trying to get on the ground and find out what is happening in clinics or what's happening in research, so that we use interviews or surveys or focus groups or other things to try to bring a kind of data to the endeavor of bioethics. So I think it's important to say there are very different methodologies that are part of it.
No, this is fantastic, Sarah. Thank you. Because actually, my next question was going to be, what are the main questions in the field, and what are the main questions that you guys are asking yourselves in your own research? So this is perfect, actually. So James, let me start now with you, and then I'll give the mic to Jennifer afterwards.
So what I study, is that?
Yeah, and sort of like the main questions, or sort of adding to what Sarah was saying, the main broad questions in the field and what you specifically are focusing on.
Well, my first doctoral proposal was a comparison of the treatment of the fetus and the brain dead in Japan and the United States. And fortunately, that proposal didn't go very far because I'd still be working on it, trying to master archaic Japanese. But I did start working for the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics, worked on questions of healthcare reform. This was during the Clinton healthcare reform proposal. And then got very excited about questions around genetic engineering. So a lot of my work has been focused, and especially since we started the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, it's been focused on questions like human genetic engineering, anti-aging therapies, nanotechnology, and artificial intelligence, of course. And those have broadened as to relate to Sarah's point about the broader significance of bioethics. The central philosophical questions in a lot of these domains also apply to things like animal ethics, ecological ethics, geoengineering, and those kinds of questions. So it's been broadly about emerging technologies, but I've been specifically interested in the question of personhood and personhood ethics applied to animals, robots, human beings.
Thank you, James. Jennifer, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I began my research in bioethics in the field of forensic science. Later, I learned forward medical bioethics through the rights of the doctors. So I start with questions like, what is the obligation of the doctors in healthcare crises in their own lives are at risk? What are the steps of a doctor can take when they make an ethical decision in their job? Maybe do doctors have rights, and what are they? How much we learn from the experience for Wilbrook study and Tuskegee study? What are the motivations for relying in an article, and why I still cite academic sources? Because I start to research about some of scientific integrity and academic integrity. So maybe that will be some questions about the bioethics that I feel interested.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sarah, do you want to add something here? Yeah.
Sure. So the question is more about what are the broad areas of interest in bioethics. And I think I have my own very particular one. I've been working with this Neurotechnology Center and thinking about devices in particular through the BRAIN Initiative in the US, but devices that alter the way we interact with the world, like being able to read out from neural activity to control a robotic arm, or maybe reanimate a paralyzed limb or something like that down the road. And thinking about the ways that those devices affect the identity, the agency, the relationality of people who are using them. They're kind of very exciting, cutting edge technologies, but they're not just unadulterated good either. And so some of the work that we've done in empirical ethics is around interviewing the early users, kind of brain pioneers who are trying these devices and have this interesting experience of moving something without moving their bodies, just through thinking. And that's fascinating, right? And it's worth exploring with them through, in our case, phenomenological interviews. What does it feel like when you do that? You know, do you feel responsible when something happens? Do you feel responsible if it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to? But, you know, that's one little niche area. And I think there are really interesting questions in bioethics beyond that, that I appreciate other people are working on. And I try to figure out ways they might intersect with other work that I do. You know, I think about all the forms of discrimination and oppression that are in our societies and the ways that they make their way into bodies through weathering, for instance, or into clinical interactions or scientific research interactions. And, you know, I think about somebody like Keisha Ray has a new book on Black healthcare and talking about ethics of what's happening outside in the unjust world and how that has an effect, a very negative effect inside clinical structures or research structures, and then trying to address that more thoroughly. Or a different area that I would think about is I think we focus a lot on individual choice and control, thinking about liberal origins of a lot of the bioethics and bioethical principles, and trying to reinsert questions about justice or re-emphasize questions about justice within that context. So, for instance, I know there's a lot of work recently on expansions of physician aid in dying in Washington and Oregon and a lot of states in the US now. Physician aid in dying is legal, but under very narrow constraints. And there's a big push to try to expand that to people who have, for instance, psychiatric suffering or, you know, I don't know if I should say untreatable, but treatment resistant anyway, other forms of psychiatric conditions, or, you know, into children, or in Holland, thinking about elderly people who, then the phrasing that they use, have completed life and don't want to live even if they don't have a terminal illness. And I think it's fascinating because I understand from the position that people are in why that might be a desire. And then also I think that there are these social constraints and reasons why people might be led to that, that we could also shift and change. So I think, you know, that kind of tension between what we think is good for the individual, any particular individual, and then thinking about society more broadly is a central kind of concern for bioethicists right now. I'll leave it there.
Just to reinforce Sarah's point, one of the first studies as a young bioethics researcher that I did was an examination of advanced directives in healthcare. And when we discovered, as many people were, that people weren't very good at predicting what they're going to feel about being sick when they actually get sick, that they don't understand the advanced directives that they've made and their actual consequences, that the advanced directives that they make don't actually have much impact on clinical decision-making, and that deferring decision-making to your family members turns out to be just as effective as trying to write an advanced directive. It really calls into question this notion of radical self-determination and makes us think about how socially embedded we are.
Right. Jennifer, I just wanted, you know, if you want to add something.
Yeah, I think that is very important in our field to talk about the relationship between doctor and patient, and the way we should we should understand the dialogical way that we can explain maybe a disability or making decision. So it is for me very important to understand the way that the doctor explains to their patients, maybe the languages that we use to be clear with the people. I think that is a very good topic for me. And it's a very good topic to explain to the patient. So maybe to approximate to the speech to the doctors, between doctor and patient.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm learning so much, but, you know, understanding that bioethics is such a rich field where, you know, a lot of things are interconnected, not only disciplines, but, you know, the private and the public spaces of individuals and bodies and how they interact. So maybe a question that for our viewers that are not necessarily versed in bioethics is, you know, what and you're all sort of touching on these issues, but why should we care about bioethics if we're not medical professionals, right? Why is it important to care about these issues? And again, you're already touching on this question, but I would like, if you can explicitly just tell us why should we care about this if we're not medical professionals? So Sarah, I'll start with you.
Great. I teach it's a medical ethics class, but it has a broader scope than just in the medical clinic. And in that class, I often talk with people. Many of them want to be, nurses or physicians or somehow in the healthcare field, but not necessarily. And I just say these are questions that will be relevant to you as a human, right, member of the public, someone who will seek medical care, because they cross the lifespan. If we think about reproductive ethics, even if you're not using any technologies to do that, there are lots of questions just around how you're treated as you seek prenatal care, or as you try to get pregnant, or in your caring for your infant postnatally, right? There, like right now, abortion rights are a really big issue, and thinking about how we protect women's health when politically, right, women's health has been put in conflict with fetal health, even at very early stages in so many states. So these are questions that will affect you as you're going through your life. And in the middle, like all the things around getting care, defining what diseases are, figuring out, how we do informed consent so that somebody can really have a say in the way that their medical care and their treatment goes, if their family's involved or not, right, how they're involved, to the, right to refuse treatments, thinking about end-of-life care, all across our lifespan. These are the questions that are relevant to us. So I think I never feel that I have to motivate people to care. They are already living it and having experience with that. In the college student age that we have, people are experiencing their first, often real struggles with mental health issues because of the newness of the situation and because of when some kinds of psychiatric disabilities tend to present. And so thinking about, what are the ways that we think about this as a bodily issue and think about it as a social issue, so that we make living with different ways of being in the world more reasonable, right? More effective and enjoyable and all that kind of thing, so that we have fair access to the goods, right, of a human life.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, so much. Jennifer, please.
Thank you. I think that all advances in biomedicine have repercussions in our daily life. From the development of artificial intelligence as a tool in medicine, let's think about today we have robots that provide support in high precision surgery and even reduce the number of the days that the patient spends in the hospital after their surgery. The recovery in medicines that help us to face major disease. Bioethics is not the only provides a reflection on what is happening with medicine. It also provides us with the panorama of the analysis that is carried out from the humanities, and even demands that the discourse of be arranged in such a way that we can all understand. Regardless in the school level, medicines offer us a solution. So I think that is very important to have in our common life reflection about bioethics, because it's all the biomedicine tools and advances is for all, and it's every day we can experiment the proximity with the biomedicine.
Thank you, Jennifer. James, please go ahead.
Sure. Well, one of the kind of sociological points I often make is that bioethics issues start in a fairly abstract philosophical domain, but that they eventually make their way to things that everyone is worried about. And I think an example of that for me was the Terry Schiavo case in Florida, where we thought, bioethicists had thought that 20 years before that, we had solved the important questions about how decision-making about someone in Terry Schiavo's condition should be treated. And then it turned out when it hit American politics, it was not at all solved, and there was a huge controversy. So that relates to a general point I would make is I think a lot of the bioethics questions are not specifically questions for the ethics of healthcare professionals, but they're general citizenship ethics questions. How the things like the trolley problem, where you're trying to make basic consequentialist decisions, and we have those decisions throughout our life and in our politics all the time. But certainly the issues that Sara mentioned, reproductive and parental obligations, the debate over abortion, how we're going to deal with long-term care as we become a graying society, how we deal with things like drugs like Ozempic, whether the limits of obesity that we're applying it to are the correct limits, how we deal with drugs like cannabis and psychedelics, because perhaps we have a right to control our brains in those ways. So there are some really fundamental questions that lots of people care about.
Yeah, and I mean, please, Sara, go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I think I'm living this issue about long-term care right now in my own family circumstance. And I think, there are ways that we say that we have a healthcare system and an insurance system, but the systems are not well coordinated and they're not really systems anyway. And they're very much set up for individuals. So I have two parents who both need help and have long-term care insurance policies, but the long-term care insurance policy doesn't recognize that they live together and can share help. And so each time there's an analysis of each of them separately, and everything has to be separated. And they are a unit, and we just don't have any way within our kind of policies and regulations to take account of that. And it means that things get missed or are over covered in ways that don't make any sense at all. And so I think, at the end of life, and as we have an aging population, we really need to pay attention to how these systems get put together and hopefully improve them. And then, going back to James's point from an earlier question, just in this country anyway, think about healthcare reform and how we provide the appropriate safety net for basic health for so many people who really do not have access right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Jennifer, please.
Thank you, Sara. But don't you think that is that could be because of the respect of autonomy of patients? Maybe this try to be each other only in one time. No.
No, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think there are places where we want to make sure that we're checking in with individuals about their particular needs. But then I think there can be a layer over that where we recognize the interrelation between people, the significance of our most intimate relationships for how we get care, right? We're also thinking about it right now in the context of trials for these neurotechnology devices, where somebody who's a participant relies very heavily on other people around them, not only to get them to the study and provide other forms of emotional support and that sort of thing, but also for a kind of what we're calling epistemic support. So how do we know when the device is working well or might be shifting something about this person? Interestingly, the individual themselves may be less aware, but people who live with them closely can observe those sorts of changes in a way that a researcher or a clinician, given the way we do clinical care here, right? Very short, very brief, you don't get to know people. They just can't do that. So I think it's just, you want to preserve space for that individual autonomy, but then look at our nestedness and the relationships around us to take account of them.
And actually this, I'm going to ask another question, a different question. And it's, I mean, we have right now people that, do bioethics in Mexico and then in the United States in this seminar. So one question that is coming up for me is, how is it that people that do bioethics inform public policies, right? Is there actually a dialogue there here in the United States or in Mexico? Is that something that it's happening or not really? I don't know who wants to go first here. James, go
Well,
ahead.
I'll just say that there is a long history since the Carter administration in the United States of bioethics commissions that are presidentially appointed and that attempt to inform the creation of public policy, usually not terribly effectively, but and they have been fraught with political conflict. But there are also bioethics agencies that I think are more effective that are embedded within the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, even the DoD. The space program has a bioethics advisor. So there are many different avenues for bioethics to inform public policy, the nonprofit sector and academia, of course, being even more important.
Sara, do you want to add something?
Yeah, those are all great examples. And I think in my own case within the Brain Initiative work through the NIH, they have a neuroethics advisory group that both sort of consults with program officers and potentially fundable projects to make sure that, any potential issues are taken care of or addressed, or just, to have different eyes on them. And they convene sessions to try to talk about upcoming issues like the identifiability of brain data or imaging data, or, in our world, there are implanted neural devices in trials, and thinking about when those work well for people and the study ends, what happens after that? Are there post-trial obligations to try to maintain that benefit or maintain the device itself, because it's a very specialized kind of knowledge? And I think, that's where you can see ethicists talking about these issues, scientists and program officers coming together to try to figure out, okay, if this does seem to be a moral obligation, how can we go about funding it? What are the structures we put in place? And now, for instance, in calls for the Brain Initiative funding, there are sections about long-term care plans. So I think you can see that kind of interaction in specific areas, not always effective, as James said, but at least, those conversations get started through this kind of interdisciplinary conversation.
And I would just emphasize the importance of the ELSI funding that came through with the Human Genome Initiative, that it began a practice also with nanotechnology funding where certain amounts of money were carved out specifically for the ethical, legal, and social implications of the technology. So that's been a huge benefit to the field.
Wow. Jennifer, can you, oh yeah, Sara, sorry.
Go for it, Jennifer, and then I'll.
Yeah, Jennifer, can you tell
Thank
us?
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, the dialogue between bioethics and public policy is limited. Also, the Congress of the Union here in Mexico, they are consulting academia on around euthanasia, assisted reproduction, and so a lot of other topics. But I think that we can improve it a little bit more and be more participate in this kind of topics.
Sara, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a group that I've been working with lately. We're calling ourselves, for right now anyway, Leadership in the Ethical and Equitable Design of STEM. So thinking about ethics integration efforts when you have big scientific projects like the Genome Project or the Brain Initiative, or individual projects that are funded under those. When there are ethics components, and there have been around stem cells, around gene editing and CRISPR, around neurotechnologies, any of these new forms of technology that have this possibility of reshaping the way we are in the world. I think there's often a call for ethics integration, but then thinking about how do you do that effectively so that you don't have somebody funded for a very tiny amount calling out every now and then, right? Don't forget to think about, and then it doesn't really have an impact, but that you really have this robust, integrated effort across disciplinary backgrounds to think through that. And it's one thing, I feel really lucky to have been in this position at UW where when our Center for Neurotechnology formed, they reached out to philosophy and said, we think we probably need to talk about this kind of thing. Do you have somebody there who can do this with us? And it's a 10-year project, right? And over 10 years, we had philosophy grad students who are embedded in labs, going there daily, meeting with people, right? Being part of that and kind of just in a way being a Socratic gadfly in the lab, working with them, but also saying, why are we doing it like that? Have you thought about this? And are you thinking about privacy issues? Can I talk to the participants in your research studies so that we can better understand how they feel about some of these questions? I think, so it's not just that you might have separate bioethics advisory councils or something, but you might explore how to really integrate those questions. And I think not only around ethics, but thinking around justice. How do we think about equity in this domain? One of my colleagues here, Tim Brown, is working on a kind of big brain cell atlas network. And what's the normative brain? What kinds of brains go into deciding what the norm is for how these things are structured? Those are really interesting philosophical science, technology, and society questions that, in our experience anyway, the scientists are interested in and love to have conversation partners to work through those things with. And then I think some of it is figuring out, how do you facilitate this and make it robust engagement, across these disciplines?
Yeah. Sorry, James, were you gonna add something or no? Oh, okay. It actually made me think about, like people always look at the humanities and it's like, well, what are you going to do with a degree in sociology or in philosophy, And these are, I think bioethics is just such a rich area where there's so many practical ways that our questions and our inquiries can actually, have some graspable outcome. So yeah, thank you all so much for pointing that out as well. So let me shift gears here a little bit and let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, AI. And so I'm asking this question because I know all three of you have engaged with this issue. I mean, James, you published a couple of books under this topic, Citizen Cyborg and Surviving the Machine. Sara, you have research and have papers on the topic of neuroengineering, and you just talked about your involvement in the UW project. And Jennifer, you have an important contribution in a book about medicine in the digital age. So I think you're all kind of embedded and aware of how AI is just being a really big part of our lives. But how is it that is affecting bioethics and the questions that we're asking in the field? So James, let me start with you.
Well, my doctoral dissertation was basically on the question of whether nurses with artificial intelligence could take over significant parts of what doctors do and do it better. And I still hold the brief for that case, but the diagnostic and therapeutic AI, I think, is going to be one huge issue that we've been developing it for 30, 40 years, but now we're going to have agents that are going to become increasingly powerful very rapidly because of the advances that artificial intelligence is making. So I think the kind of hassle factor that a lot of physicians have had resisting the informatization of healthcare, that will be reduced by these new tools. Case management will be one of the functions that artificial intelligence, we already know, does a lot better than actual, social workers in many cases. Being able to look at 12 different medications and figure out whether they should all be taken at the same time or not something the average human doctor can do. But I think finally, the part that's also been interesting for me is the application of bioethical ideas and principles to the artificial intelligence debate, the AI safety debate. I'm working with a team of Italian Buddhists. We're writing a book together about how Buddhist ideas could be applied to the development of AI consciousness and what it would mean for an AI to be conscious and those kinds of questions. So I think there's a lot of ramifications in both directions.
Thanks, James. Jennifer?
Thank you. I think that artificial intelligence should be thought as a tool, just like that. And as a tool is designed by people in which himself has the same limitations as the person who is programming it. In other words, if person who programs artificial intelligence it is a person who does not have gender perspective, for example, the answer of provided by the artificial intelligence will be in that context. So that is very important to understand. Design as a tool, it provides a great support, as James says, for systemized tasks as an allied tool of million images provided by CT scan in the concept of health of the field. It can help and eliminate the gap in access to health that marginalized population have, and can even be supporting the waiting the times in the emergency situation, such as stroke. In the moment we give it moral status and recognize autonomy in the artificial intelligence, then in those moments we should be uneasy. For now, let's worry about the people who are programming and the interest that they have in.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sara, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to second Jennifer's point about thinking about the range of experience of people who are programming or beginning to program AI and the data sets that are training the algorithms. And I mean, we know that it's such a powerful and amazing tool, and also that it gets things wrong now, right? And we can try to do corrections on that. And I think it's important to do that. But part of that is thinking about who's part of those teams, what are the assumptions that they're making, right? What are the training sets? And then I guess I would also say, I think some of it is around, when we think about the kind of public problems with it, the legal case where large language models just hallucinate cases, create something, and our ability to authenticate and know if we can trust something when we don't always have transparency into how AI is getting to its decision or its answer or what have you. I think that's really, it's a distressing kind of problem that goes way beyond bioethics, but will be clearly an issue within bioethics as well. And I guess I think about the ways that AI informed devices, whether there are computers, or browsers, or Google questions, Bing AI, just trying to write emails. Now I get lots of purportedly agency enhancing finishing of my sentence offered to me, but in ways that I think constrain what I think that I want to say, and I resist. But it is easier if you just tab over and take that. And I worry about the idea that it's a powerful tool. We're going to use it in some way, right? But that we think we're actually improving our way of getting through the world, our agency supporting us, but that we leave out things that are important. And, again, not necessarily a bioethics focused issue, but I think about the way that people use large language models in ChatGPT now to write a cover letter or write an abstract for a piece. It can do it. It can do it pretty well. But also that's an opportunity to shine, right? To have your individuality shine and to use your voice. And I think we homogenize in a way. And that's another thing that I worry about, not just the authenticity of the answer, which is a big deal, but also just the pressures to make use of it in, a time crunch environment where we think of it as a tool, but then does it become a mandatory way to get through the world in ways that will get rid of some of the valuable forms of diversity and kinds of expression? I want to recognize at the same time that I think it's so valuable for language learners to have better access to things that are out there that were inaccessible before. It's just, right, as with all technologies, there are real benefits to be had and also so many concerns about the way that we implement it.
Just to pick up on Sarah's point, I think one of the oldest traditions in ethics is the ethics as a way to understand what kind of a life to live. And that often bioethics has not addressed that. But one of the ways that we're beginning to think about that in relation to artificial intelligence is the more of our capacities that we offload to artificial intelligence, does it diminish our own capacities? For instance, our capacities for doing certain kinds of reasoning if we just rely on these kinds of tools. And so this reemergence of virtue theory and as to think about what it means to have a good life in relationship to technology, I think is an important discussion that we need to have.
Jennifer, do you want to add something else? Okay, perfect. Okay, so let me start closing this seminar by asking you the last question, which is, in the humanities and in the social sciences, why should we pay attention to bioethics? And I think we've touched on this throughout the conversation, but maybe, as a closing remark, you can sort of, if you can put it in a nutshell, why is it that we as, people that dedicate our lives to studying, the human life or the social life as individual or collective, why should we pay attention to these issues and to these questions? So Jennifer, let me start with you.
Thank you. I want to share something with you. At the end of the 1960s in the United States, a law in the medical humanities was enacted, addressing the population concern about the loss of close contact that doctors had with their patients and supplemented by evidence-based medicine. This allows to incorporation of medical ethics, medical psychological, history of medicine, and anthropological studies of medicine. This is just one example that the great value that humanities have in bioethics, not only because they provide the foundation of bioethics, but also because they give us the clarity about the society really wants and needs. I think that's a very good point to start.
Thanks, Jennifer. James, let's continue with you.
Well, I would just go back to my point about bioethics being essential to being a good citizen in our modern day. And I'll just say briefly that one of the studies that first convinced me of that was research on how the decision in the United States to adopt the brain death standard of death was adopted. And they surveyed all the people who'd written about it, doctors, lawyers, philosophers, priests, rabbis. Turned out that the philosophers were the ones who really influenced everybody else's decision. And that's when I realized that, there's some basic issues in ethics that if a citizen doesn't understand, they just don't understand what the conversations are about. I have backed off on the argument that teaching bioethics or ethics in general will make the professions or STEM or whatever more ethical or more socially sophisticated. I think there's equal evidence that learning bioethics teaches you, or ethics in general teaches you how to argue for anything that you want. So it may not actually change moral behavior that much, but at least you understand what you're doing better.
Right. Actually, that was going to be one of my, if we had time, I was going to ask that, like, should we start teaching, these issues at a maybe more elementary level? I mean, Sara does philosophy for kids as well. And should we start like incorporating these questions and these issues at an early stage so people can sort of be aware of this? Sara, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to do it at an early stage, but I agree with James. It's not what philosophers do isn't moral education aimed to make the better person, but to make the more aware person, right, who can think through these issues and realize dimensions of their behavior or practices and assumptions that we take that need examination. But then I'm a pluralist. There are many ways that we get through the world, and we're not aiming to, do character education and make people one particular way. I remember in my first job, the administration thought about sentencing a student who had cheated to my class. And I thought, well, that's not maybe the right angle on why we want people to take ethics, but yeah, so it might not lead to that. I think, why should we pay attention? We bring really important perspectives given the kinds of training and experiences that we have as humanists, as philosophers, to these kinds of emerging technologies or practices that we have. And I guess what I love about bioethics is the interdisciplinarity and the realization, it's almost like we each feel a piece of the elephant. We can look at the same phenomenon and understand it more robustly when we have a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds in the room talking through it. In our lead project, I was interviewing somebody who said, people have their own reasons for going into law or philosophy or neuroscience. But when we come together, given those reasons and that training and our positioning, and we talk about the same thing, we're going to do better at figuring out how to improve the practice than if we're just me sitting in my chair, philosopher's chair, thinking through it, or, the legal scholar only paying attention to law. So I guess I think the nature of our problems and issues they're so multifaceted and complex and rich that we need something like bioethics that has that interdisciplinarity to it.
Well, thank you all so much for this super rich conversation. I want to thank you for, sharing your knowledge with us and of course your time. I know you three are super busy, so thank you so much. And I hope to see you next time in another of these conversations. Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us. And nice
Thank
to meet
you.